I never had a real sex talk with my parents, and the instant the subject would come by, the explanation was so businesslike, bland, and matter-of-fact that I just lost interest. My penis had only ever been a device I used to urinate at random intervals during the day, and my mind never stayed a second on it. The only time I entered my thoughts was to keep it out of the way of stray feet that an occasional girl excuse me, that an occasional girl would aim at that part of my body. Being in a terribly unsensual family, I couldn't understand how sex could even be tolerated. It seemed so dull. I found femininity beautiful, but I couldn't find anything about a woman that would make any guy willing enough to go through sex. There were no secrets of the feminine body that I didn't know. I tried to act female, emulated the patterns and behaviors of any female in my presence. I had dressed and undressed countless Barbies. I looked on as my mother browsed through countless Sears catalogs with hundreds of models sporting the latest, most revealing lingerie that was available. I had even showered with my mother several times when I was young, a memory so incredibly vivid and accurate that I don't doubt its authenticity, though my mom claims otherwise when I mention the subject. I was interested in males to an extent, but not in the same sense. My brother and father were definitely not prime examples of the sensual male. Sensuality seemed to be excluded from their makeup completely, as opposed to all the female influences I had seen. My mother was sensual in her own way, while my sister was a virtual whirlwind of emotion. All the other male influence I had was limited to my family surroundings, and needless to say, all the other men in my family were a bit too past their prime to pose any interest to a developing child. What could be more attractive to a child than aged people? And yet, something fascinated me about the male figure, but because I could never put my finger on it, I never bothered with it in the end, especially since male sexuality seemed so taboo. Females seemed a lot less complicated to me because they were a lot more open and straightforward than men. I was never interested in the increasingly blind and short list of discussion topics among the male faction of my family. So, during family get-togethers, I'd shift over to the female faction, absorbing every word because it was so much more stimulating a discussion than motors, hunting, making sausages, or whatever other stereotypical male conversation you can think of. As far as the female influence I got within my family goes, the female entity had no more secrets for me, especially for the absorbing, hungry, and observant and keen mind of a developing child. The world of men remained for many years a remote planet, bleak and unattractive. I still had this nagging feeling in the back of my head that there was something I was missing. There was something about the male psyche I had not yet understood. The dimension was sexuality, and with that understanding would come the perception of the emotion of ultimate caring, affection, and passion, love. When I was around 7 years old, I was enrolled into what I considered another of these unmotivating, monotone, and useless male activities. I became part of the Scouts. I never really wanted to be part of the Scouts. My parents used several methods of persuading me to join, believing it a healthy activity to enroll me in. I conceded because I believed my participation would make them happy and proud. It ended up being hell, a nuisance and an obligation. I detested the whole thing, though I never told my parents, and because my family watched me every step of the way. They drove me in. They came a bit earlier at the end of the sessions to watch us hold the closing ceremony, and then talk with the Scout leader master for a bit. I hated it because I felt embarrassed, because I was surrounded all the time by family. It was not so much embarrassing in the end as suffocating. I suffer from this sense of suffocation to this day. The only reason why I conceded to join the Scouts was because of the promise of camping out in the woods with friends, far from family eyes. I was beginning to grow tired of always being followed, carried, led, and watched over by my family, because they had a very overpowering presence, and they ministered my ability to take full advantage of any situation, because they too would be involved, pulling their 2 cents to where they thought was needed, and diverting me from anything they found that was less than savory, and would either put me in some sort of peril, or, in most cases, expose me to influences they didn't want me exposed to. It was no exception with camping with the Scouts, and I was sorely disappointed and agitated. I was beginning to crave very strongly for interactions and experiences that were otherwise denying me, keeping me in the careful fold of the family. At every camping expedition, either my brother or father or both would come with me. They had their reasons, and they were good, but only served to increase the sense of suffocation I experienced. I felt as if it was probable to be separated from them for a second, and that happiness was unattainable unless in their presence, because they were the people who determined every single thing I did. Happiness was not something that I experienced much in my childhood, and became more and more apparent as I grew older. I was scared of my strict parents, especially my father, for more reasons than his strong opinions. He had a tendency to get violent if he was really sent into a rage. I remember when my brother had come home from his transcript from CJEP, showing he failed all his courses, when he had lied all the time that he was acing everything. The one thing I remember most was my father smashing my brother into the kitchen spice cup board. When I was 8, my father beat me badly. I don't even remember why anymore. I had done something particularly offensive at school, I guess, and he decided corporal punishment was the proper course. He was rather forceful in this punishment. Where I was scared of him before, I was now dead frightened, not to mention extremely hurt. What followed was a real traumatic province police intervention, a court case, and being separated from my family for a week. Even though I was scared and hurt, being away from my family was like ripping my world to shreds. That feeling, if anything, is what made me ask the lawyer who represented me to please get me back home, and I didn't want any of this to continue, which resulted in a drop of charges. I never really got over it though, and I never understood why. I just know that ever since that experience, I've always been very distant from my father. I think this contributed very much to our later problems. That will be explained later, as it makes sense. My family also pervaded into what was the most sacred thing for me for many years, until finally a killer blow sapped me of my passion and love for it. I started playing piano when I was 10 years old, and from the very beginning, my family was right there behind me. My mom would drive me to each lesson, and she would stay and watch the lesson as it transpired. She would sit directly behind me on the couch in the living room of my teacher, doing knitting to keep her hands busy, but always attentive to what was going on. She would involve herself in the lesson when she deemed necessary, enforcing points that the teacher made when she thought it was important and or due, reporting my practicing habits of that week, and always watching me when she wasn't looking at her needles. I could never get any privacy when I practiced piano. There was no dividing factors in the house, and the piano was very near the kitchen, where my mother always worked and where we always ate at night, and where all the commotion of the whole house was centered. Whenever I had an inspiration to practice, or was in the proper mood, it was always during peak family hours, like after supper, or before it, or when my mom was cleaning the house so the vacuum would be going, or she'd be mopping around me while I played. What annoyed me the most was when I was concentrating on playing, and they would stop right beside the piano, look at me, and listen. It was a distraction. It made me nervous, and that I was always found to be special activity that would release my inner emotions would be intruded upon. They even stayed during my piano examinations, not going anywhere after they'd driven me to the appointed place, but staying and talking to the teacher, waiting and hovering over me, a constant presence in my mind.